I was diagnosed with Tourette Syndrome as well as OCD when I was, when I was in like third grade or something, third or fourth grade. My parents had noticed that I, as a kid, was twitching a lot. I think like my face and my arms, and also at the time making like humming noises and just making weird actions, and also like tapping doors when I didn't need to or whatever. And so kind of like some of those odd, kind of erratic behaviors. It's hard to describe, but I mean, I've heard all these things called tics. Not the bugs, thank goodness, but more just kind of like jerks or just kind of like brief like spurts of action, that sort of thing. So I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome and OCD pretty much at the same time because, I mean, part of Tourette syndrome is kind of like feeling like you can't stop doing a certain action, like doing a certain tic or something. And like, I'm always aware that I'm doing it. It's not like I have like a brief blackout or anything like that. I know that I'm blinking. I know that I'm blinking and things like that. But like, I think OCD and Tourette syndrome are often very related because like when I blink, for example, I feel like I have to do it a certain number of times in a row. And if I don't do it correctly, then I have to do it again, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If I didn't do that correctly, and I know what that means somehow, then I have to do it again. Other OCD things I did was flipping light switches, smiling in a mirror, tapping doors. I knew I didn't need to, but I felt like I had to. My Tourette syndrome symptoms were more severe when I was, slightly more severe when I was in middle school, but they've mellowed out over the years. How did that happen? I think mostly it just kind of naturally happens, but I can't quite explain that. But I think another part of it is that I just got tired and sick of doing some of the OCD and Tourette syndrome things I was doing. Flipping light switches, tapping doors. That vocal tic was especially annoying to me and to other people. I just didn't want to do that. And so I told myself, no, this is a very annoying thing. This is disruptive. This particular tic is disruptive. There are certain environments where that's not appropriate to do, especially. So I would often just like fight the urge, and eventually I didn't feel like I had to do it anymore. Not sure how helpful that is, but that's my experience. So around when I was in 8th or 9th grade, my parents and I decided to seek professional help, professional treatment. We first went to a psychiatrist because we were considering medications. There are some medications that you can take to alleviate or reduce the symptoms of Tourette syndrome. After talking with the psychiatrist and explaining my symptoms, I personally didn't want to do that. Since my case of Tourette syndrome was milder, as a teenager, I didn't feel comfortable taking medicines that would alter my brain if I felt it could be some other way. So I think for more severe cases, there are definitely very effective medications and safe medications out there. It's just not something that I personally wanted to do. I found visiting a psychologist very, very helpful as he helped me to find strategies. I don't know much about what causes Tourette syndrome. My understanding, and this is very simplistic, is that there's like a part of the brain that for most people it tells you to kind of stop doing something when you want to. When you want to stop doing an action, then you stop. For those with Tourette syndrome, that function is slightly malfunctioning. For example, blinking or jerking my head. Sometimes I just feel like I have to keep doing it for a little bit. Although it's really weird. It's something about the mind that kind of feel like you have to keep doing it, maybe until you do it right or something. So there's a little bit of OCD in there. They may be a bit related, but not very descriptive, I know, but that's my understanding. I've mentioned focus and strenuous activity or exercise before, but I also failed to mention relaxation. So meditation, mindfulness, just kind of inhaling and exhaling for like 5 seconds, inhaling for 5 seconds, exhaling for 5 seconds, that sort of thing. And that also helps a lot, just kind of to keep me grounded, to kind of like, even if I feel the urge to do any of these tics, when I'm relaxing, I can just tell my mind is kind of empty and open enough to just say, no, I won't do that. Not right now. And it's a really nice feeling, just kind of to have that desire to like blink or wrinkle my nose several times, to have that desire to do it, but then just to say no, let it go. What I've seen for myself, and from what I've heard of many other cases, there have been two main two main types of activities that seem to help most for people with Tourette syndrome. They tend to be highly focused, like activities that require a lot of focus or a lot of strenuous activity. For me, especially in high school, I loved acting in musical theater. I loved orchestra, performance type things. And so whenever I was focusing and really present in the performance, I wasn't doing any tics, especially since I didn't want to do any tics when I was acting a person that didn't have Tourette syndrome. I've heard of other people being a drummer to deal with all that excess energy, and also there's a book called The Strongest Librarian, where a librarian with a severe case of Tourette syndrome does a lot of weightlifting to cope with it. And so think about some of those sorts of activities to help you kind of deal with what Tourette syndrome does. One time I met with a psychologist about my tics because I wanted to try to manage them more, and this was while I was in high school. And probably the most helpful tip that he gave me was for maybe a week or several days or a week or something, keep track of how often and how frequent the tics happen throughout the whole day. I realized that when I made a log for at least a week, I realized that for me, the tics were more common in the early to mid afternoon. So not so much in the morning, not so much at night, but they kind of got more frequent as the day kind of wore on. Maybe like stress, maybe things might start to weigh in my mind during school and things like that. So if you notice patterns, then that will, I think, go a long way to help you to cope with the symptoms of Tourette syndrome. I personally have a very mild case of Tourette syndrome. Right now, my tics or the things I do are really just like blinking, jerking my head, sometimes tensing my arm, that sort of thing. A lot of these kind of like twitchy things. So I kind of sometimes jokingly refer to myself as a jerk face. Good-spirited all the way. It was a little worse when I was in elementary and middle school. However, I actually had vocal tics like or I felt like I had to jump in place and kind of thump my hand against my chest after jumping in place. It was all as one thing. But then it all sort of mellowed out as I got into high school and further on into college. So I'm grateful for that. So I still have some of the mild symptoms, but it was worse when I was younger. I had very encouraging and supportive parents who encouraged me to kind of be more be more open about when I was in high school and middle school, more open about how I talked about talking about my Tourette syndrome. They encouraged me to ask some of my best friends like what they thought about it. So I had a good friend at the time named Kyle, and I was nervous to talk to him about it. But when I told him about my Tourette syndrome and why I did it and why I did the tics and whatever, he told me what I thought was remarkable was that he said that, well, first of all, he was impressed that I trusted him enough with it to talk with him about it. But most significantly was that he said that he kind of forgotten about it. Like he probably noticed it when he first met me, but since we became friends, it just never crossed his mind. He just never notices it anymore. And so to me, the people who matter the most, it doesn't bother them. In middle school, when my Tourette syndrome was more severe than it is now, more noticeable especially, there were a few kids that did make fun of me, copying my movements or the sounds I made, kind of mocking me, thinking I was weird or silly. There was one time where there was a girl who was especially kind of persistent with her teasing, and so I spoke with a student counselor about it, and this was in middle school, probably 6th or 7th grade. And so me, the classmate, and the counselor had a talk about that, and she stopped. But again, as the tics have mellowed out, there have been some people who have kind of maybe commented on or wondered why I was like doing this sort of thing while I was presenting. But in another clip, I'll explain like what happens when I told a friend about it. I think another thing to keep in mind is that, like, especially kids, at least me as a kid, I didn't want to annoy people with my weirdness, my weird tics or whatever. So I try to suppress them, so like to not hum during in school or something. But I would just feel like I'd have to do it otherwise, and so which is kind of hard to explain, and so. It helped a lot to understand that, Tourette syndrome is something that's hard for people to kind of define and understand fully. There's something in the brain, and I don't think like even brain experts or psychology experts fully understand what's going on, but it's still kind of like an issue that's there, and so, but also just knowing that like, letting people know that you love them. I think one of the best things to recognize to support someone with Tourette syndrome is to know that they have they know what's going on. Like they know they're blinking, they know they're humming, they know they're saying things or doing things. But they're aware of it, and it's partially under their control, but not not entirely. If you'll forgive the comparison, it's kind of like how. Well, there's a certain kind of like cycle of hormones and emotions that women often have. It doesn't control how they feel from one part of the month to another, of course, but it does affect them to some degree. People with Tourette syndrome, by my experience, there are these urges to satisfy these tics or these things, these kind of like jerks. As someone with Tourette syndrome, I am very aware of how exhausting it can be. Just like my forehead muscles, nose muscles, arm muscles, especially these days, sometimes just get tired from, I feel like, overuse. And as I said in some other clips, relaxation, focus, activities with that have helped me a lot with kind of coping with these kinds of things, and also just being open and being willing to talk about it. If someone might think that you're weird or something, and you can explain. I think the people who really care about you, your best friends, the people who love you, and your family who care about you, it will matter less to them because they will see you more as a person rather than a person with Tourette syndrome. I am aware that there are several good websites, and I think there's an association dedicated to Tourette syndrome. I don't know any off the top of my head. I don't use those online resources at all, but they're easy to find with a quick Google or Yahoo search or something. I will say that, as I mentioned in another clip, visiting a psychiatrist and or a psychologist is very, very helpful, I think, to kind of help you to understand more about your case of Tourette syndrome, how you can cope with it, and handle it, maybe how you can talk with other people about it, that sort of thing. So apart from like online resources that are pretty easy to find for those who want to, talking with people, talking with experts, talking with people who care about you, is probably the best advice that I can give.